Have to keep working at it. You have everything you need? More coffee or something? You could do muffin or something. And that's where I get relief. Where I get
Good morning. Good morning. Is it on? Anybody tell me? Yes? No? Maybe? All right. So Dr. Powell is out in Philadelphia for the national ACP meeting that many people are attending. And so I have the honor of introducing Dr. Chesnutt this morning. So Asha Chesnutt completed her undergraduate and medical school education at the University of Virginia. She then went to the University of California, San Francisco for her internal medicine residency and critical care and pulmonary fellowship. She moved to Portland in 1996, at which time she joined the Pulmonary and Critical Care Group at the Oregon Clinic. She continued to work there as a clinician educator, supervising PPMC internal medicine residents during their ICU and clinic rotations. She worked for the Oregon Clinic for 20 years, leaving in 2016 to become the medical director at Providence Health Plan, where she oversees pharmacy and quality. Today, she is joining us to talk about vaping, the new nicotine. So, Dr. Chesnutt.
Thank you, Cortland. It's really good to be back here at PPMC. As Cortland said, I was here for 20 years and left in 2016, so it's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces. So my topic today is Juul, Suorin, and vaping, the new nicotine. And it's really as much evidence-based talk as it is a public health message to really get the information out there about the negative effects and health consequences of vaping. I don't have any disclosures. So recently I had the opportunity about 2 months ago to go to Patagonia, to Chile and Argentina. So I have a few slides that I'm going to intersperse between the talk just to give you something nice to look at while I speak. So this is Argentine, Patagonia on the drive to El Chalten. So the way I got interested in this talk is simply two reasons: being a pulmonologist and being the mother of 3 children ages 18 to 23. And the vaping epidemic is really real. It's really out there. So many teenagers do this, and they think it's cool to do this. And I really feel it's my obligation to really get the word out there and to educate this community about the dangers of vaping and the evidence about it, so that you can have the conversations you need to have with children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whoever it may be, so that you give them the accurate information and that you start and really discourage the use of it. So if you were going to read one article at the end of this talk, or if you got interested in this subject after the talk, I would read this May 2018 New Yorker article. And it's called "The Promise of Vaping and the Rise of Juul." So teens have taken the technology that was supposed to help grown-ups stop smoking and invented a new kind of bad habit, molded in their own image. And this is a quote from in that article. "You're expected to Juul, but you're expected to not depend on it. If you're cool, then you Juul with other people and you post about it. So everyone will see that you are social and ironic and funny. But if you are addicted, you go off by yourself and Juul because you need it, and everyone knows." And I think that really sets the stage for this talk and where we're at. So my outline today is to first, here we go. Talk about just basic chemistry of combustible cigarettes and nicotine, then really answer the question from the get-go: do e-cigarettes help with smoking cessation? Go through all the terminology that you hear about e-cigarettes so that you understand what the different devices are, the chemistry behind the flavorings, and then finally moving on from sort of the science part of the talk to the public health and marketing part of the talk, which is the rise of Juul and adolescent vaping. And then finally, what I feel that is really all our mission as healthcare providers going forward, and that's what we can do as a society. So some basic statistics. So remember back in 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General linked smoking to cancer, and then there was a 1988 big report on nicotine addiction. So 1.1 billion people smoke worldwide, and cigarette smoking kills 480,000 people, Americans, each year, 87 of which die from lung cancer. 32% of atherosclerotic heart disease deaths are due to smoking. However, when you look at the trends for combustible cigarettes, we're actually doing well. So right here you have the Clinton era, in the middle graph the Bush era, and then the Obama era. And you can see that the overall trend from 1993, which is this, to 2015, is an overall decline in the number in age-adjusted smoking prevalence. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a Children's Health Insurance Reauthorization Act, which imposed a federal tax on cigarettes. The Family Smoking Prevention Act. And then finally, the ACA part in March 2010 allowed for a lot of funding for smoking prevention programs. And then as an extension of that Affordable Care Act in 2016, the FDA took control over e-cigarette. So going back to now the chemistry behind cigarettes, we start with the Nicotitiana tabacum, which is the nicotine plant. It really dates back to 1000 BC, which I found very interesting. And it really became a major industry in Europe by 1700. So the tobacco leaves are harvested and then cured and made into these leaves that can be rolled and smoked. This is the basic chemical structure of nicotine, and it's important to realize the number of receptors that nicotine affects in the body, mostly dopamine, but there's a lot of neural feedback circuits involved. So remember that nicotine in and of itself is not carcinogenic. It's the other chemicals that over 70 of them in tobacco smoke that have been identified as the true carcinogens. But nicotine is the addictive substance. Reaches the brain within 15 seconds of inhalation. And that rapid increase gives you a rush, and it's faster than even IV administration when you inhale it into your lungs. And then it leads to activation of dopaminergic neurons. And then there's the feedback mechanisms of it's a stimulant as well, so you have an increase in heart rate and you have an increase in blood pressure, and then there's positive reinforcement, so you keep craving it. And then when you withdraw from it, it causes anxiety and stress. So when you talk about combustible cigarettes, which is what we all know as cigarettes, there are over 7,000 chemicals in the smoke by lighting tobacco leaves on fire. Greater than 70 of them are known carcinogens. The average smoker inhales 1 to 2 milligrams of nicotine, and try to remember that because as we talk about nicotine content in e-cigarettes, that's a good number to remember. So 1 to 2 milligrams of nicotine per cigarette. So if they average 10 puffs over the 5 minutes that the cigarette is lit, so and there's 20 cigarettes in one pack, that gives you 200 hits of nicotine. And then there's, again, that rush followed by feelings of withdrawal. So when we go through terminology, hookah, and you'll see hookah lounges around town, hookah is actually a combustible form of smoking. So you generate smoke. And it started back in ancient Persia and India. And hookah cafes are very popular in the college age population, going to a hookah lounge. But remember that is not the same as vaping. That's a combustible form of cigarette. So when you compare the two, again, there's hundreds of substances in the smoke from combustible cigarettes, but the main ones to realize that are the bad actors are the carbon monoxide, the cyanide, nicotine again, formaldehyde, arsenic, nitrosamines. E-cigarettes really have 4 to 5 substances. They have something called a humectant, which is 2 substances, either propylene glycol or glycerin, and I'll get more into that in a bit. And that's the solution that the nicotine is dissolved in, so it can be heated. It has the nicotine itself, it has water, and then it has flavorings to make it more appealing. And then I put other in there because we're still finding out as studies come about, like what are these other substances. And we definitely, there's been many studies that have found different heavy metals and different nitrosamines in e-cigarette smoke. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the combustible cigarettes. And now we're going to go on to what our current state of knowledge is about e-cigarettes and do they help with smoking cessation, because that was the intended intended use for them. I think the best articles and best summaries actually come out of the UK. And remember that in Europe, there's still a lot of smoking, more smoking than there is here. And the Public Health Commission had this very comprehensive review of e-cigarettes in 2018 from and Public Health England, so I'll read this to you. We identified 14 systematic reviews of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation and or reduction published since our last report, 7 of which have included meta-analysis. The authors arrived at the same conclusion that further randomized controlled trials are needed. The reviews that included a meta-analysis produced different results. 2 found a positive effect on cessation for e-cigarette use, and 4 found inconclusive effects for cessation, and 1 found a negative effect. So the verdict is still really not out. However, we have a more recent study that gives us even a little bit more information, and that was published in the end of January in the New England Journal. It is, again, out of the UK, and it's a randomized trial of e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy for smoking cessation in British subjects. It's important to remember that this trial was not blinded, so it was an open randomized trial. But it did involve 886 patients, and they were randomized to 2 types of therapy. One was nicotine replacement therapy. Of note, 88% had combined modality therapy, which means that they had 2 forms of nicotine products. So they had either a patch and gum or lozenges and a patch, so 2 forms. And then a second generation e-cigarette, which I'll go into in a minute, but that's basically an e-cigarette with a refillable cartridge so that you put the e-liquid in there. Both groups had 4 weeks of behavioral support. The 1-year abstinent rate was 18% in the e-cigarette population and 9.9% in the nicotine replacement population, which was statistically significant. I think the really amazing thing or important thing to take away from this study is that 1 year, 80% of those who quit using e-cigarettes were still using e-cigarettes. And when you look at what the current FDA-approved therapies in this country are for smoking cessation, it's the 5 NRTs. So you have a gum, a passage, a patch, lozenges, inhalers, and nasal spray, bupropion or Wellbutrin, and then varenicline or Chantix. And when you compare what e-cigarettes do to these kind of standard replacement therapies, they're pretty much on the same range. So if you use a nicotine replacement therapy plus bupropion, it's a 20% 1-year cessation rate. If you use varenicline, it's 26% at 24 weeks. So there are some differences between the UK and the United States. So Public Health UK has encouraged smokers to switch to e-cigarettes, claiming 95% less harmful than combustible. They have very strict restrictions on the sale and where you can buy it and all that. So it's a very regulated product in the UK. And they really are starting to even consider, there's legislation there where they're starting to consider it as a prescription so that you can get a prescription from your doctor to stop smoking with it. US is a different story. So e-cigarette is not an FDA-approved smoking cessation tool. And the CDC has pretty much had this statement come out. So e-cigarettes have the potential to benefit adult smokers who are not pregnant if used as a complete substitute for regular cigarettes. And I think what you'll see in the next 4 to 5 years as now he's resigned, but as the FDA is going to start really regulating the e-cigarette industry more, is that they put a delay on it, and so they're now seeing what the different companies and manufacturers of e-cigarettes can do to have different varying nicotine concentrations so that they can actually market their device as a smoking cessation tool. So I think that that's what's coming, and there was like an open forum to deliver information to the FDA. So this is the classic Fitzroy Range in Patagonia, and when you hike, you're walking up here, and then you actually walk up that, and then you're up here, and then when you're at the top, you see this lake. And it was, unfortunately, we waited for 3 days to try to see to have the clouds dissipate, but it didn't do that while we were there. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on to the part of the talk that I think a lot of people are really interested in, and that's the very confusing terminology around these devices. And is it vaping? Is it clouds? What's juuling? So to go through that in quite a bit of detail. So the overall terminology for the whole set of devices is called ENDS, or electronic nicotine delivery systems. And you have very varying names for that. You have e-cigarettes, you have e-cigars, you have various vaping products. And the bottom three are trade names. Juul, Suorin, and Blue and Vuse are all trade names of different types of devices. But they're all things that you'll see in, New York Times and various articles. So it does cover a wide variety of products. The basic thing to remember is that they're battery-powered devices that heat a solution to create a vapor. And remember, so it's not a smoke, it's not combusting, it's not putting the tobacco leaves on fire. It's heating a liquid element to create the vapor or steam. And so that vaporizes the liquid and forms an aerosol. There's no combustion or no combustible products. And they can contain flavors plus minus nicotine. Only about 15% of products out there don't contain nicotine. So, and then for a more visual schematic, again, you have a battery, that's the energy source. You have an heating coil or an atomizer. You have e-liquid that comes in various forms. And then in the cartridge, the e-liquid is in the heating element, and when you turn it on, it heats up the e-liquid, and then you inhale it, and you create an aerosol. And I think for the best understanding is to really understand it as generations of devices and where we're at now, which is third generation devices. So the first generation that came out, really back in 2003, 2005, in its earliest forms, was just something that was meant to look like a cigarette, but it was electronic. And then you went into this vaping pens here, where you had in this black, you had the e-liquid here, and you can buy e-liquid and then put it in there, and then smoke through the vape through the vaping pen. I'm going to try to use that distinction because it's not smoke, it's aerosol and vaping. And then you have third generations, and they're either mods or pods. And they have a battery source, and that battery source is a much higher voltage battery source. And so it generates a lot more power, and you can, you buy the device, and then you again either can buy cartridges or buy refillable e-liquid. And then just another picture to show you what kind of things are out there. So really what we're mostly interested right now is on the third end, which is this is a Juul product. Looks like a USB port. And so you have either refillable cartridges or refillable liquid, or you can just buy the cartridges here and put them in. When you look at kind of the anatomy of a pod-based system, this is Fix, which is another product, and this is Juul. So this has the rechargeable battery. So you literally just unhook it here, and you have a USB port. So you just put it into any USB charger. And then for Juul is patented, so you have to buy these in either 4-packs or 10-packs or 20-packs, and they have different flavors, and then you just plug it in to vape. So again, back to the comparison, we have the propylene glycol, the nicotine, the flavorings. So now I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail. So what do we know about nicotine content in e-liquids? And there's actually been over now 27 clinical studies, and it really varies so greatly between the product. You can range from 16 to 48 milligrams per ml in your content. It depends on your puffing protocol, and I'll get into that, and then what kind of biomarkers you choose to look at in the studies. And it's very different between e-cigarette naive users and e-cigarette experienced users. So naive users, as one would expect, would get much lower levels of nicotine when you measure cotinine or other byproducts in their blood. Whereas experienced e-cigarette users can get very high levels in the range of combustible cigarettes. So The propylene glycol and the glycerin are humectants, and that's the delivery system, or that's the liquid that it's dissolved in. And and this is a good slide to take home too, is that, I mean, these are not harmless products. And obviously, propylene glycol is what you find in antifreeze. All these other subjects have been found in studies of e-cigarettes: formaldehyde, which is an embalming solution, ethyl benzene, acetone, and rubidium. And then there's been a lot of outcry about the flavors and how the flavoring has really lured all the teenagers into vaping. And there's over 15,000 flavors of e-cigarettes. It's just crazy. And it's still counting. And they have really cool names like Tutti Frutti, Jam Monster. There are a lot of fruit flavors. There's creme brulee. Mango's really popular. And it's important to remember that some of these are cytotoxic flavors. You have cinnamon that creates these chemicals that I'm not going to try to pronounce here. And then cherry. Cherry was known very early. I remember going to an American Thoracic Society lecture on e-cigarettes back in like 2014, and they were starting to really study it. And they figured out that cherry was one of the worst flavors you could use. And one of the very important compounds or chemicals that's been found in especially the sweeter flavors, the fruity sweeter flavors, is diacetyl. And the pulmonologists in this room know about diacetyl in terms of its relationship to something called popcorn lung. And that's in Canada several years ago. It was found that the people that were working in one of those butter popcorn manufacturing factories that you get all your buttered popcorn with were developing a bronchiolitis obliterans picture. And it was through a lot of very interesting, it's a great story to Google it and read about it, but what they were finding that it was the compound, the diacetyl, that caused scarring in the airways and produced bronchiolitis obliterans. And there's diacetyl found in definitely the there is a buttered popcorn flavor of e-cigarettes, and definitely you find it in that, but you also find it in many of the sweeter flavors. There's been a lot of hype on menthol lately, and is menthol bad for you? And the bottom line with menthol is that there's nothing in and of itself bad about menthol, but menthol was just created way back in the 20s and 30s as a way to lure really two populations in their marketing, and that's African Americans and women, because it produced that minty flavor, I guess, and people liked the minty flavor, and they marketed it toward that population. And to tell you again how strong, so if you look at this slide, it's from 1950 to 2016, and on the y-axis is a percentage of the total cigarette market, and on the bottom is a percentage of menthol, so it keeps rising. And to tell you how strong the tobacco lobby is that even in 2009, the Black Caucus in Congress was split on a menthol ban. So that keeps coming up, it seems like decade after decade, but hopefully that'll go through. So these are some pictures of vaping clouds, and that's part of the culture too of vaping, is to create these clouds. It's not smoke, it's vapor or steam. And so if you just, we'll go through some social media slides in a bit, but it's pretty impressive to see what kind of clouds you can do. I thought about going and buying one and trying it, but I didn't do that. Yeah, I just couldn't bring myself to do that. But, you can drive by. I walked in Boston visiting my daughter, and I walked about 4 miles, and it was in the BU area, and in that 4 miles, I think I passed 10 vaping shops. So that's in an area full of college students and young people. And they become like lounges too. So like you have vaping lounges, so when you go in there and you try different flavors and you go generate the smoke. So it's really important to get across to you all that this is a culture, and this is a culture that's been created. There's actually something called vaping topography, and that comes out in all the studies that that are scientific studies where you're trying to study what are the chemicals that you find in bloodstreams after vaping. And so vaping topography has to do with, what's the puff duration, how long are you inhaling, what's the time between the different puffs that you're taking, the number of puffs in a vaping session. So some people might just take one puff and then put it down. It's not like a cigarette that burns out. So you turn it off, and then you might not take another puff for a long time, whereas other people are just, constantly puffing. Obviously, the longer the puff duration, it's associated with a higher nicotine yield. When you read articles, especially on the web, lay articles, it talks about user experience, which is a throat hit. That's the terminology that they use, is a throat hit and the sensation in the back of your mouth when you take a vape hit. And then the third generation products, again, have really high wattages. So you can have higher delivery, and you can create a longer puff. So to give you an idea of what's out there, this is a UK lifestyle, and it's a pretty flashy website. You can find information about iPads, about iPhones, about what's the best restaurants in London, all this, but this is their take on e-cigarettes. And I want to read this for you so that you really understand the culture that's out there. And this is kind of going through like how you select what kind of vaping product or e-cigarettes you want to use. So the first bullet, most vaporizers use a liquid suspension, as I said, to deliver nicotine. Throat hit and flavor are dependent really on the glycerin and propylene glycol. Glycerin, vegetable glycerin, is a thick, sticky, sweet liquid that produces a maximum vapor at the expense of throat grip and flavor. So e-liquids with a higher glycerin ratio are preferred by cloud chasers who tend to use a direct-to-lung technique, a method that involves literally sucking in a full lungful of vapor as if breathing through a pipe. Now, propylene glycol, however, provides a much better throat hit, similar to that of a tobacco cigarette. E-liquids with a higher propylene glycol ratio are better suited to those who want the mouth-to-lung feeling of cigarette smoking. So in a nutshell, a 50-50 mix is best for those who want an intense flavor as well as a throat hit, whereas a 20-80 mix provides a smoother inhale and bigger clouds, but a milder flavor. I read that and I was like, oh my gosh. And then nicotine is the final ingredient. So when you look at the studies and see what's actually in these e-cigarettes and what is the toxicant exposure and how does that compare to combustible cigarettes, I think the best study that's out there was in JAMA. It was based on a cohort study of 5,000 patients. They did a ton of biomarkers in that study of various organic compounds, nitrosamines, metals, and they definitely did find that use of e-cigarettes is associated with a known exposure to tobacco-related toxicants, but the exposure is reduced compared to combustible cigarettes. Very recently, in the last 2 months, there was an animal-based study on looking at 3 types of cells that we have in the airways in our bronchi, basal cells, goblet, and ciliated cells. And they put that chemical that I just talked about with the popcorn lung, the diacetyl, or a blank solution. And they found that exposure to the chemical diacetyl led to a decrease in the number of ciliated cells compared with the exposure of blank solution. And cilia, as you all know, is a really important mechanism in our airways and lungs to take out bad stuff that we inhale. All right, so to summarize where we are right now in 2018 with the public health consequences of cigarettes, I think the best resource for that is this 100-page document from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That was published last year. It's like a 100-page document, and what I'm going to do is there's 5 sections to it, and I'm just going to go through the summary points. So what do we know about the constituents? So the current evidence supports that e-cigarette aerosol contains fewer numbers and lower levels of toxicants than smoke or combustible cigarettes. Nicotine exposure can mimic that depending, again, on your usage, but it's very variable. So it's really hard to know unless you know how much the person's using. And then the exposure to nicotine depends, again, on the flavorings, humectants, and how it's used. What do we know currently about the human health effects? So the evidence suggests that e-cigarettes are not without physiologic activity in humans, but we just don't know. And I think that's really the take-home message is, we don't know what the long-term effects are on morbidity and mortality. But we do know that it's probably less harmful than for existing disease in combustible cigarettes. For initiation and cessation of e-cigarettes, and so the evidence again suggests that while it might cause the youth to use them to transition to the use of tobacco and combustible tobacco products, it might increase adult cessation of tobacco products. So, again, what's happening in adults is different than what's happening in the adolescent community. Harm reduction. The evidence about harm reduction suggests that across a wide range of studies and outcomes, they do probably pose less risk to the individual than tobacco products. I was trying to keep this talk as up to date as possible, and so I had to figure out a way to put this slide in on Monday. Is that we're finding out new things every day, and so I think that that's really my bottom take-home message is we just don't know. I mean, they haven't been around that long. We're just studying them really in animal-based models and a lot of cohort studies, and so we're always finding new things out, and the most recent find was the 35 reports of seizures among e-cigarettes users, mostly teens and young adults, and so now the FDA is looking into that. Okay, so now we're going to switch from the kind of scientific and where is the current evidence on smoking cessation, where's the current evidence on e-cigarettes, and what do we know about what it happens, the consequences to our body, to now really the marketing, the industry, the social media, all the things that some of you in the audience may not be as familiar with. And again, starting this talk, I said I had 3 kids between 18 and 23. So I asked them last week, 2 don't live here, so I asked them in a text, what percentage of people do you know, just that you know, not necessarily your friend group or anything, but just do you know have a Juul and are actively Juuling? So my 23-year-old who's out of college and working said 30%. My 22-year-old who's in college as a senior on the East Coast said 10%. And then my 18-year-old who is a senior in high school here said 40%. 40%. I was just like floored. I mean, I knew that, and that's one of the reasons I'm giving the talk, but it's very disheartening to hear that. So this is a New York Times Magazine cover article. I think it was a couple of years ago, and I'll just read. This is a college student here, and it says, one girl on his dorm sold Juul pods from stock she had bought in a guy who ordered armloads on the internet. Unlike back home in high school, college students vaped in public everywhere, in lecture halls, at hockey games, in the common rooms. So Juul is a patented pod device that was started by Monsing and Bowen in 2007. And like a lot of other stories in the Silicon Valley, they were Stanford master's design students. And when you read articles about them, they say that they really started the product to help adults with smoking cessation. When it came to the market, it had a 5% nicotine content, which is higher than anything else that was out there. And every other product out there at the time was 1 to 3%. It quickly rose to a 75% market share, and it has about that kind of market share right now in the US. And then now, to compete with that, most other vaping pen cartridges have increased their nicotine content, and they have contents of about 5 to 7%. They have a patented salt-based nicotine, and it's a pronated form of nicotine that they have in their little pods, in their little things, and it's less acidic and it's less harsh. So apparently it has a smoother feel. Plus, it's a cool-looking device. So when you look at these kind of devices, this is the Juul. This is the Blue and Suorin, which also have, because they're pod-based, they also have a share of the market, but less so than Juul. So this is why it looks like a USB port. This is the little charging thing that you just unplug from here, and then you charge your device, and you put that on one end. These are the little flavoring cartridges that you put in. They're one-time use, and there's 8 flavors. which I'll go through in a second. So this is Juul's social media. I think they've done, when you just Google Juul and you'll get it, a lot of things, but they've done a lot to really make their device look cool, be cool. These are, again, the images for vaping. And then this is, on my phone, I just put #Juul, and I saw what I came up with, and I tried to pick a screenshot that was appropriate. And I put this on there. And so that's, there's just hundreds of Juul sites, thousands. So this is from their website. And so, again, back to the content and what we just learned and talked about is they have a 30-60 mix of propylene glycol and glycerin. And that's to create a visible vapor and a smooth hit. They also have some benzoic acid in there, and then they have the nicotine, and again, they use this salt-based nicotine salt. And then they have 8 patented flavors currently. And so these are the little flavoring pods that you buy to insert into your Juul device. So you buy one Juul device, and then you just keep inserting the pods. And then, I never owned a cigarette lighter, but apparently, one of the cultural things, especially back in the 50s and 60s, was to own very fancy cigarette lighters. You can do the same thing with Juuls. You can buy a $10,000 Juul pod. You can buy colors, skins. You can customize your Juul pod, and there's lots of sites on that. And so they offer nicotine in both 5% and 3% strengths. The most popular flavors are mango and creme brulee. They also have, a couple of tobacco flavors that simulate a real cigarette. So the strength of a pack is, so remember that there's 20 cigarettes in a pack. One Juul pod is about the equivalent to 1 pack. So one of those little flavoring pods is 1 pack. When you look at Suorin, which has a much higher voltage, so it's a bigger device, it's a bigger cartridge, and it actually can have as much as 3 packs in a Suorin cartridge. And this is a picture of the Juul website that you get on when you look at, when you just Google the company itself. And they say that their mission is to improve the lives of the world's 1 billion adult smokers by eliminating cigarettes. And then most recently in December, these guys became billionaires. Because Altria bought it for $12.8 billion for a 35% stake. So when you look at the industry, it's all familiar people. It's all the tobacco companies that own these products. So Views over here is owned by R.J. Reynolds. Altria, which I just mentioned, who bought Blue, also owns Mark 10. And Altria, also makes Marlboro, and they're the parent company of Philip Morris. So that's who makes Mark 10 and now owns Juul. And then Imperial Brands, which makes Newport, owns Blue. So again, I think part of why I'm here too is to make sure everyone who doesn't have a teenager or understands that this is really a cultural phenomenon. This is a phenomenon of our youth, and it's a very common thing. They talk about it. They post about it. It's just what is happening right now. You can go to lots of sites, and they're talking, and it's very cool-looking models, and and they're asking, well, is vaping bad for you? Well, it's not as bad as smoking, and that's the message that's being hit to our adolescents. It's not as bad as smoking. So enjoy the biggest clouds of fruity or herb-tinged vapor possible with the best vape pens. I thought about showing a YouTube video, but again, they weren't very appropriate, but there's just hundreds of YouTube video posts on different things you can find out about vape pens, how to make your cartridge last longer, how to get a better throat hit, yada, yada. You can follow lots of these sites on Twitter. And then the bottom line is that Juul has really marketed themselves as being the cool product. High school students think Juul is cool. That's the bottom line to take home, is that they think it's cool. They're just, they see images like this on Instagram, on all their social media posts. It is just thought to be the cool thing to do now. this was a view we saw after the French Valley hike in Chile and Patagonia as we were getting back to the boat. Okay, so now I'm going to finish up with kind of where we stand on the adolescent vaping statistics, and then finish up with where I see us going and what we can do. So the statistics and articles that you read in the lay press are definitely true. These are two New England Journal articles, but looking at the estimates and then the concerns about Mod Pod. So obviously we see a lot of it in the lay press, but we're also seeing a lot of it in our own literature. This is a CDC infographic, which I think is a really a nice infographic. So right now in 2018, more than 3.6 million U.S. middle and high school students have used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. And that accounts for about 20 to 21% of high school students and 5% of middle school students, so 6th to 8th graders. More high school students vape than smoke. This is 2011 to 2018. The yellow curve is smoking rate, and that has gone down. And this is the e-cigarette rate. And as you can see, from 2011 to 2018, which is that 20.8% statistic, it's kind of gone up. And I think this is a visual to show you how rapidly this is happening. So this is just a comparison from 2017 in the yellow to 2018. And you can see visually just how much it's rising year to year. So this is the quote from our now exited FDA Commissioner. "I will not allow a generation of children to become addicted to nicotine through e-cigarettes." So I'm going to finish up, and I'm going to leave enough time for questions because I think you will have some. I wanted to let you all know that there's really a lot of sites out there that help people, people want to educate in high schools, want to educate even to families or people that you're talking to. Probably the most comprehensive one, and this was one from Stanford. It's free, it's online. It's a series of videotapes, a series of PowerPoint slides that has basically 7 one-hour talks on a lot of geared toward adolescents. It's a very lay talk geared toward adolescents that is available to the public, that many high schools. I mean, the high schools, I know my son's high school has had a lot of talks on vaping. The FDA also has a prevention campaign. It's called The Real Cost, and it goes through a lot of, again, infographics, PowerPoint slides that you can access. So I want to kind of finish up in the last 3 slides of what's the bottom line. What have I talked about the last 50 minutes? And then we'll have time for questions. So the bottom line is e-cigarettes have the potential to benefit adult smokers who are not pregnant if used as a complete substitute. Remember, it's a complete substitute for regular cigarettes and other smoke products. They're not safe for youth, young adults, pregnant women, or adults who currently don't use tobacco. While e-cigarettes have the potential to benefit some people and harm others, scientists still have a lot to learn about e-cigarettes and as an effective quitting cessation tool. If you've never smoked or don't use other tobacco products, don't start. And then to reiterate what is contained in the e-cigarette aerosol, and I think this is something that when you talk to grandchildren, children, you should really say that there's volatile organic compounds, there's nicotine, there's fine particles that I'm sure we don't know about yet that's going to come about that we're going to find is depositing in the airways of the youth that are using them. There's been studies that have shown heavy metals, the diacetyl, and then potential cancer-causing chemicals. And those are the nitrosamines in the organic compounds, and those are found in combustible smoke. And now there's some studies that are shown that they're found in e-cigarette smoke. Definitely at lower concentrations, but they're still found there. And then scientists are still learning about the long-term health effects of cigarettes, and here is what we know now. E-cigarettes contain nicotine, which has known health effects. It's addictive, it's toxic to developing fetuses, it's harmful to adolescent brain development. Again, the rush, the dopaminergic neurons being stimulated, the increase in heart rate, the feedback cycles. And so that continues, and adolescent brain development continues into the early 20s. And then it's obviously a health danger for pregnant women and developing babies. So what I've hoped I've done here, I think I talked fast because my talk was about 5 minutes longer a couple of days ago, but what I've hoped to do here in the last 50 minutes is to make sure you're all educated on the chemistry of nicotine, what nicotine does to the body. We've talked about whether e-cigarettes help with smoking cessation, and yes, they do help. Again, that most recent New England Journal showing an 18% cessation rate, but that's really similar to the cessation rate of bupropion and nicotine replacement therapy. We've gone through what the public health, what we know now about e-cigarettes and their toxicants and public health issues. We've gone over the terminology and that we're really talking right now about Juul or pod-based systems, which are 75% of the market. In terms of the chemistry, the sweet flavors and the popcorn flavors are the worst for you because of the diacetyl compound. But I honestly suspect that, there's 15,000 flavors out there that I honestly suspect that as time goes on, we're going to find more and more bad news about certain things, certain flavorings, or the constituents in the flavorings. And then I hope I've educated you on how this is really a societal issue and that we're really at a point where the marketing of the industry, and again, the industry is the tobacco makers, the industry is all the big tobacco companies who own these e-cigarette products, and that they're still marketing toward the youth, and it's Juul is cool, and it's getting perpetuated on all the youth social media sites. And so again, my purpose for being here is what can we do moving forward, and it's really to be knowledgeable, because you're in conversations at restaurants, you're in conversations with people, and they say, well, are e-cigarettes really bad for you, or what's wrong about them? They say that they'll help you stop smoking, and now I hope that you all have the tools to be able to say that we really don't know, and that every day we're learning about new bad consequences of e-cigarettes, and that they have bad organic compounds, they have nitrosamines, they have all these things that are known to be bad for you. So I hope that you all go out and deliver that message. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Some studies have indicated that perfume that many people use have more volatile compounds, chemicals, than cigarettes, and that it's like secondhand smoking. In your opinion, as a pulmonologist, which is a bigger public health problem? Do you know? Is it cigarette smoking or the use of perfume, which many of us use and smell it?
Yeah, in terms of, the question was, to repeat the question, is what, as a pulmonologist, do I think of perfumes and the public health hazard of that? I mean, I definitely have educated asthmatics and people who have reactive airways about that, and make sure that they don't use very strong smelling perfumes, because just that smell will trigger their airway hyperreactivity. I've certainly not come across large population-based studies, and I haven't looked for them on smoking and consequences in the lung. Yeah.
I've had patients who are vapers who don't consider themselves smokers.
Right.
So are they ex-smokers? Are they current smokers? Are they, do you figure out quantity based on how fast they go through a cartridge and do the cigarette equivalent?
Yeah.
Like, what are your recommendations around that?
That's a really great question, and I think that verdict is still not out. Like, when you look at the literature, like, it's really hard to study these folks, because you have e-cig naive users, you have e-cigarette experienced users, and you have very different studies based on those two things. And then I didn't get into it, but then there's this whole literature on dual users. So there's people who use both, that they smoke combustible cigarettes and they vape. And so that's another population. And I don't have a good answer for that. But I do think it's, but when I was still having clinic patients, I mean, I really, in the last since Oregon legalized marijuana, I got really in the habit of asking not only about tobacco smoke, but about marijuana use, and was really finding out a lot about how much my patients were smoking weed. And so it's going to be that same kind of thing. It should just be another thing now. You have your alcohol, your smoking, your marijuana, and your vaping. Yes, back there. Hi, Bernie.
Yeah, fascinating talk. Thank you. The question I have is this smoke, because if it's truly an aerosol, most aerosols precipitate out in the upper airway, and unless they're not organic, and so then you should be able to determine what's in the smoke that's causing it to look like smoke.
Well, it's steam. The vapor cloud is steam.
But the steam should be, I mean, since it's steam is water soluble, so wouldn't it be absorbed in the upper airway, the mucous membranes?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I spent a lot of time really trying to distinguish between the combustible and the vape, and that's how the way that they describe it in all the literature is that when you take that hit of the vape pen, the aerosol, which has organic solvents in it, the propylene glycol and the glycerin, goes into your lung and it gets into the small airways, and then and that's how the nicotine's absorbed. And then, depending on the content, you create that vape cloud and you exhale the aerosol, as you saw in the pictures. John?
Can you comment on how much this costs?
Yeah, like the Juul device is about $40, just to get the USB stick vape pen, and then each cartridge, and I think a cartridge of 4 is about $10 to $12, and then if you buy like if you buy 20, it's a little cheaper. It's like $20, and then when you can buy them online. And they're trying to regulate it more, and I went on a couple of online sites, and all you have to do is click the button to verify that you're 21 or 18, and then you can get it.
Last year, a class action lawsuit was filed against Juul for
Yeah.
apparent marketing towards younger people. Do you have any information or update on what happened with that?
I don't. I did see yesterday, my husband sent me something that now 11 senators have asked for specific, and this just happened yesterday with the retirement of Scott Gottlieb. So 11 senators have asked for all the documents from Juul. Yes, in the front row.
Just to sort of solidify the cost question, could you compare sort of nicotine per day, if you will, average, coming from vaping versus coming from cigarettes? Just look at
Well,
a pack of cigarettes.
I guess once you've made the investment in a Juul pod, like let's say you've already got the pod for $40, and then you're just buying the cartridges. Remember that one cartridge is equivalent to a pack of cigarettes. And I think if you had 4, so that would be $2.50. I don't know how much a pack of cigarettes costs now. How much?
About $7.
For a pack of cigarettes?
Cheaper,
Yeah.
2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Along with that, I want to ask you, what percentage of that 250 is actually taxed?
I
My
don't.
understanding now is they're not taxing.
They're not taxed.
It was on the radio just recently that they're thinking of taxing.
Right.
Is it a question, if you look back at one of your slides about 6 slides ago, you had the crisscross like that
Mm-hmm.
of, use of e-cigarettes going up
Mm-hmm.
and ordinary
In use.
cigarettes down.
Mm-hmm.
But if you add them up,
Yeah.
like that,
It's even higher. Yeah.
So is this really a commercial sort of enterprise of get them
And there's a whole emerging literature on that I didn't get into, and that's another statistics that's coming about is the percentage of adolescents that are vaping that then go on to use combustible cigarettes who might not have never smoked at all if they weren't vapers.
So as a father of a 15-year-old son, I'm having these conversations weekly.
Good.
But I'm wondering, because this is a culture, because this is happening in schools, the schools' methods of dealing with kids who vape is discipline. Suspension, expulsion. What is the medical community's potential role in working in a larger structure around the culture to support alternatives for kids to not have to have sort of this binary path of either you're staying or you're going to be disciplined and have these tremendously burdensome impacts on their sense of well-being
Mm-hmm.
because it's addressed through primarily the mechanism of discipline.
That's a great question. I don't have the answer for that. I think that there are, I contacted the ALA to see if what kind of programs they have, and they're really school-based and individual school-based programs. I know that one of my, Bill Bauerfein said that he's involved in a program he's a pulmonologist that outreaches to some high schools. I called my son's own high school and to see if they needed any more education or teachers needed education like this. But they felt like, they had been doing a lot of it and they've had several things. So other than just trying to be really vocal in your own community, it's really a public health crisis, and I don't know how to get a handle on it. And social media is a powerful determinant of what these kids see and what they react to. Yes, Becky.
This must be a tremendous gateway drug if 8th graders are using it, 8th graders on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, to more than cigarettes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Marijuana. Are there any vaping products that don't have nicotine?
Yeah, it's it's about, depending on what you read, about 10 to 15% of the market are just the flavorings, the sweet flavorings without any nicotine. But again, it's they put, the companies are smart, like once Juul came out and had a higher nicotine content, they all raised their nicotine content. And so it's a nicotine that gets them addicted because it's the feedback cycle. You crave it and you want it again.
In terms of adults and, supposedly trying to use these to quit smoking, I'm trying to get a better handle on the nicotine content. So you said to remember that a cigarette has 1 to 2 milligrams of nicotine. Is that the nicotine that's in the cigarette itself, or is that the nicotine that would be
It's the content. It's in the
that's
cigarettes.
just the content?
Yeah.
Because of course a lot of that goes up in smoke
Correct.
in the room. Whereas with the Juul or a vaping device, everything in there is going to be inhaled. Now, when they talk about percentages of nicotine in the Juul, what does that translate to in terms of milligrams?
No, and that's where, when you look at the studies, they're mind-boggling because, they actually take these kids and put them in a room and they try to standardize their vaping protocols, right? Because you've got how long an inhale you take, you got the number of puffs per vaping session, the duration of the puff. There's so many factors. So when you look at the clinical studies that are, generally of about 20 to 30 teenagers or 20-year-olds that are doing it, the data is kind of all over the place, and then now the higher wattage devices deliver more nicotine. So there's no standard answer to that, and the ranges that have been measured vary from 16 milligrams to 48 milligrams in the device. And then the same thing, let's take the worst case scenario, you have a e-cigarette experienced user who is using a lot of who's doing long vaping sessions and long durations. They're going to get very, very high content similar to a pack of cigarettes.
And I think we'll take further questions at the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I talked a little fast, I think, because
That's perfect.
Was it good? I'm glad there were a lot of. I knew there would be a lot of questions too. So
having
it's
10 minutes to talk.
Yeah, cool.